In this story, I'm going to tell you how my mother-in-law spent years whispering lies to turn our family against me, and how I had exactly 24 hours to find proof before she ruined my marriage. But get this, I didn't fight her with fury or secrets. I fought her with a deli receipt, a babysitter's text, and one cousin's memory. What happened at the family meeting changed everything, and not in the way anyone expected. I still remember the exact words she whispered the first time she thought no one was listening. "You will never be enough for my son." If I had known that sentence would set the tone for the next 7 years, I would have run the other way. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I am 34 and I live in Portland, Oregon. I met Mark in college. We moved in together after graduation, and we married under a maple tree in his parents' yard with 20 people and way too much lemon cake. His mother, Diane, hugged me that night and told me how happy she was to have another daughter. She even cried into my shoulder. I felt like I had won the jackpot, young in love, believing I'd been adopted into warmth. For the first few months, everything was normal. Diane brought over soup when I had the flu, complimented the curtains I chose, praised Mark in a way that made me love him more. I thought, this is family. Then the first crack appeared. One afternoon, I stayed late at work and came home exhausted to find Diane at our kitchen island, stirring tea. She looked at me without surprise and said, "You know, Evelyn, some women never seem to clean properly." Not loudly, just like that, casual and heavy. I felt my face flush. I tried to explain about the project at the office. She smiled that same gentle smile and said, "Of course you did. People like you always have excuses." I laughed it off when I told Mark, and he shrugged. His mother is blunt. She did not mean anything. I told myself it was a one-off. I was still learning to live with a partner whose mother felt entitled to comment on everything. Looking back, that was the first sign that warmth could flip into something cold in private, and I did not know how poisonous it would become. When Diane made dinner for the two of us and offered a pale, practiced smile across the table, I told myself I could win her with patience. I did not expect patience to become endurance. I should have walked away, but I loved Mark. I wanted to belong. I had two choices: leave and preserve my pride, or stay and try to fit into a family that already had its rhythms. I chose to stay. I did not know then how many small wounds would add up to something much worse. When she invited me to brunch the next week, I should have known better. It felt too perfect. I should have trusted the uneasy feeling at the back of my throat that this was not hospitality but a trap. Continuing from that brunch invitation, I thought for a moment the world might shift. At brunch, she lifted her teacup and said, "I have been thinking about hosting Thanksgiving here. You can help, of course, Evelyn." You smiled and told her you would love to help because you wanted to be part of the family. For a while she was charming in front of others, laughing at Mark's jokes, praising my lemon loaf when guests came over. But the first subtle cruelty came in private. Incident 1, the holiday comment about my soup. She stood in our doorway and said, "That dish you brought to the office party looked like it came from a truck stop." Mark did not hear it and I felt small. I cleaned it away and told myself not to take it personally. Incident 2, 2 months later, she arranged for me to babysit her niece and then told Mark, very calmly, "Evelyn is so unreliable with time. I worry she will not be good with children." I heard it through Mark, who acted apologetic, not protective. I began trying to win her over in earnest. I learned Diane's favorite flowers and left them on the porch. I cooked her a casserole the exact way she described from her childhood, cream sauce and green peas, and she ate it in front of Mark and called it delicious. But later, when it was just the three of us, she threw a lemon at my attempt, saying, "You overdo everything. You try too hard." The second escalation landed like a stone. I remembered every attempt to fix things, every compliment to her curtains, and every birthday card I had carefully chosen. The third incident was worse. At Mark's promotion party, attendees gathered at the country club and Diane let everyone know, sing-song in that bright voice she used, that Mark would have married better if he had the sense to marry someone from their high school. Silence fell like a curtain. I felt the room tilt. Mark tried to apologize and tell her she was joking, but she smiled as if she had done nothing at all. Our marriage felt the strain. Mark told me he loved me, but he also said he did not want to fight his mother. I remember sitting on the couch, my hands numb, and telling him, "You have to choose who you protect." He looked away. For a moment there was hope. Diane called and said she wanted to have dinner for the family and that she would apologize for any misunderstanding. My heart wanted to believe it. I prepared, and for a shining hour the night seemed to shift. Diane was gentle. She listened, and she said, "I have been hard on you, Evelyn. I am sorry." I almost let myself believe it was turning around. Then everything changed in a way I could not have predicted. What began as petty barbs deepened into a choreography of control, compliments in public, dismissals in private, and a constant test of my boundaries until I could not tell whether I was the problem or simply exhausted. I replayed small scenes in my head, the way she watched me serve coffee, the tilt of her head when I spoke about work, the soft, impossible curve of her smile right before a cruel sentence. I kept a mental ledger, kindness given and returned with a sting. The ledger made me vigilant. Vigilance became strategy. I started to notice the timing of her barbs, always when Mark was distracted, always when others would not notice, always calibrated to unsettle rather than to wound outright. The apology dinner was not an end but a prelude. Her softened tone afterward felt like proof she could be reasoned with, and I almost lowered my guard. That same night, after dishes were washed and the house hummed, she lingered by the sink and said, "I only react when I see someone not trying hard enough." It sounded like a confession and a threat. I went to bed believing we had a fragile truce. The next morning, that truce was weaponized in a way that forced me to choose: accept a life under her quiet cruelty or fight for a truth I could not yet prove. I did not know that her apology was a prelude. That night of false hope collapsed the way a house of cards does. A week after she apologized, she used that apology like a weapon. She told Mark quietly, while I was in the kitchen finishing dishes after she and Mark had left the party, that I was manipulative and that she had discovered I was keeping secrets to control him. She spread a false story that I had told neighbors our marriage was perfect while insisting to him that I was unhappy so I could guilt him into staying. The biggest blow came 3 months later at a family reunion in his parents' backyard. With 30 relatives gathered, the light through the old trees making everything feel golden. Diane had been planting seeds of doubt for months, and that evening she let them bloom. She stood in the center, raised her voice just enough for all to hear, and said, "We have been carrying a burden for years. We have been pretending everything is fine, but the truth is Evelyn is selfish and reckless, and she will ruin Mark's career with her drama." The guests murmured. I felt like someone had turned a faucet on inside my chest. Mark looked at me, stunned, and then he did something that cut deeper than words. He asked for time to think. The room smelled like cut grass and grilled onions, and I could not hear what anyone was saying except for Diane's laugh when a cousin asked if she really meant it. I left. I did not beg. I walked to the car, my hands on the steering wheel, and I felt the floor drop away. My friends called, but no one could undo the humiliation. In the weeks that followed, the accusation became its own small, poisonous ecosystem. Conversations that had once been ordinary about weather or work arrived folded with side comments from relatives who no longer looked at me the same way. At the grocery store, a woman I barely knew gave me a sympathetic smile that felt like a verdict. Mark oscillated between anger and confusion. He loved me, he said, but he needed space to process. When he left the apartment those nights, the hollowness filled with questions I could not answer aloud. Had I missed something that justified her claims? Was there some way my kindness had been mistaken for manipulation? I replayed every interaction with Diane, searching for the fault line I might have ignored. I considered the unthinkable, leaving Mark before the story could take root. I sat alone in our driveway and listened to a nightbird call, and in that moment I realized I had to find proof or I would lose everything that mattered. I had nothing except an email from Diane months earlier criticizing my cooking and a few texts where she had complained about me to Mark. But I also remembered a neighbor, Mrs. Han, who had always been kind when Diane was cruel, and a babysitter who had once told me Diane liked to stage things for sympathy. Could I find evidence that would change the way the family saw her, or would I watch my marriage unravel? I had 24 hours before Mark's parents planned to meet to discuss family finances, and if I could not stop the narrative, I might lose him. I had two choices: retreat and preserve what little dignity I had, or fight and expose the truth. I chose to dig. I did not know yet how dangerous and complicated that decision would be. I started by going through old messages like someone combing a shoreline after a storm, searching for anything that looked like flotsam and might become proof. Every deleted invite, every odd voicemail felt suddenly important. I paused over an email where Diane had praised Mark in front of others and then in a later note mocked the very same effort behind his back. It was small, but it showed a pattern. My hands shook as I photocopied a receipt Mrs. Han handed me. It was trivial, a lunch Diane claimed to have eaten during a visit she said she'd made to Mark's office that afternoon, but it contradicted her timeline. Each tiny contradiction tightened into a rope I intended to use to pull the truth up into the light. Continuing from that night in the driveway, I started quietly, like a surgeon tracing an old scar. The first pattern interrupt came when a neighbor, Mrs. Han, knocked on my door 2 days later. She peered over her glasses and said, "Evelyn, your garden looks tired. Diane told me you work too much." Then she reached into her purse and handed me a deli receipt, Diane's name on it, from the afternoon Diane had claimed to be visiting Mark at the office. It was small, ridiculous, and electric. The receipt proved a lie. Diane had been somewhere else the day she insisted I'd manipulated a meeting. That proof changed the rules. I began to collect details. Voicemails where Diane's voice smoothed into honey when Mark listened and snapped shut when he wasn't there. A deleted calendar invite that showed Diane had canceled a dinner she later blamed me for ruining. Texts from Tara, the babysitter, admitting she'd helped Diane stage an alibi. Each piece fit like part of a pattern I'd ignored for years. An unexpected ally surfaced: Jonah, Mark's cousin, the quiet one who observed more than he spoke. At a neighborhood barbecue, he pulled me aside. "I've seen her do this to others," he said. "She made me feel like garbage at my wedding and then smiled like a saint." He trudged through old messages and agreed to speak if needed. Hope threaded through my fear, but doubt still clawed. There was a rhythm to Diane's cruelty: public tenderness, private blade, and the rule of 3 kept appearing. 3 people, 3 corroborations. Plotting a confrontation felt like testing a parachute before a jump. I saved screenshots, printed timestamps, and met a lawyer friend to ask whether patterns of deception mattered in family mediation. Mark wavered. He loved me but needed certainty before blaming his mother. I understood loyalty. I also understood I could not live under a rumor. With 3 days until the family meeting about finances and living arrangements, Diane's allies could still bolster her narrative. I almost backed out twice, rehearsing words in the bathroom mirror until they sounded like someone else's script. The second pattern interrupt arrived in a single text from Tara. I am so sorry. I will tell the truth at the meeting. My hands trembled. With Jonah and Tara willing to speak, the risk of exposure felt less like gambling and more like justice. I packed a folder of evidence, drove to Mark's study, and told him bluntly, we either fix this now or lose everything. He looked up, tired, and nodded. We agreed to face the meeting together. For the first time in months, I could breathe, though only barely, because nothing would be the same after tomorrow. The confrontation was set for the family meeting at Diane and Mark's father's house, an old place with creaky stairs and family portraits that always made the room feel like it had memories watching you. People arrived with casseroles and polite curiosity. Diane moved through the house with that practiced smile, greeting people who did not know the full story. I traced the wood grain on a chair back to ground myself. My hands were a little too cold when Jonah slid me the printed messages and Tara took a seat at the table with a white envelope. I remembered suddenly the first lemon cake at our wedding, how Diane had cried into my shoulder then, and the distance between that night and this one felt like a canyon. The first emotional peak hit when Tara stood up and said, I have to tell you something about that night with the babysitter appointment. Her voice trembled only briefly before steadying, and she told the exact story of Diane arranging for her to be elsewhere and then calling to complain that I had not come through. She described the text threads, the flippant tone Diane used to make her sound unreliable, and the small, staged gestures meant to corroborate the lie. The room shifted, silverware clinked in sudden awkwardness, and Diane's face tightened in a way that made her seem smaller. Then Jonah handed a phone to Mark and read a message Diane had sent praising him in public while cutting me down privately. I watched faces go from confusion to betrayal like a slow, terrible reveal. Diane tried to laugh it off, saying, you are taking words out of context, and for a terrifying second the practiced charm threatened to close the gap. But I had been careful. Timestamps, numbers, receipts, and the lawyer friend I had consulted sat in the corner and quietly explained the pattern: praise in public, attack in private, and a piling on of small deceptions to manufacture truth. She called it triangulation. I called it old wounds made new. Diane's twisted logic was on display. She truly believed she was protecting her son from a partner she claimed was threatening the family's standing. The way she justified cruelty was more frightening than pure malice. She had turned herself into the heroic narrator of her own story. For a moment she almost gained sympathy, listing the ways she had helped and what she claimed she had sacrificed for the family. Then Mark, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, stood. My heart lurched. He said, I love my mother and I love you. I cannot have both if there is lying. He looked at Diane and added, I have to side with the truth. It was the second pattern interrupt, and tears sprang to my eyes, not because I had won, but because the person I loved had finally seen clearly. Diane's face flushed with rage and then sank into stunned silence. She reached for the familiar last-ditch move, blame me, accuse me of orchestrating everything to ruin her, but Tara's voice in that room, the receipts Jonah had brought, and the timestamps made it impossible to hold the lie. Family members who had been on the fence shifted forward, asking questions that Diane could not answer without contradicting herself. I noticed small things: an aunt who had always sided with Diane looking away, an uncle who had muttered, we believed her for so long, like a slow crumbling. The look on Diane's face when the truth settled in was not pure rage. It was a private, incredulous grief, as if the life she had built on careful stories had been taken from her. Relief and sorrow washed through me together. This was necessary but not celebratory. The meeting dissolved into low voices and arrangements for who would stay and who would leave the room. Diane left without meeting my eyes. Outside on the porch she waited, and when she finally spoke, she said to Mark, Mark, you do not know what you are doing. I remember the way her hand reached for his arm, then habit, possession. I had to choose right there, reach across her grasp, step between them, or let Mark decide. He squeezed my hand and whispered, we will get through this. I chose the small, steady thing, standing close and not engaging the theatrical plea. In that moment I felt the quiet revenge of normal life coming into view, the ability to breathe without always looking over my shoulder. But the fallout was only beginning. Consequences Diane could not avoid were forming, not dramatic exiles but slow shifts in who invited her, who trusted her, and who would tell their children different stories at holiday tables. I had to prepare for rebuilding our marriage and building boundaries strong enough to hold. As we walked away from the house, the old portraits watched us go, and I thought of the maple tree where Mark and I had been married. There would be work to do, apologies to navigate, and new rules to set. I did not yet know if Diane would apologize genuinely or try once more to manipulate. For now, I held Mark's hand and let the steady press of his fingers remind me that some truths, once shown, change everything. Continuing from Diane's last words on the porch, I felt the pressure of a decision that would define our future. In the week that followed, things got messy in human ways that numbers and receipts could not clean up. The family split into camps. Some relatives called Diane to say they wanted to give her space and hear her side. Others apologized to me for not seeing it earlier. A cousin I'd thought distant sent a long, trembling message about how she too had been minimized by Diane. Mark and I began going to couples therapy to repair the private holes that public humiliation had opened, sessions where we sat under a lamp's honest light and practiced saying, "I felt abandoned," instead of sharpening answers into weapons. The villain Diane refused to accept the damage she had done to her own relationships. She showed up at holidays with a practiced contrition that felt hollow, a soft voice, a small plate, a comment about how families could be complicated. She sent flowers to Mark's office with a note that read, "I miss my boy," and he placed them awkwardly on his desk while I pretended not to notice. But one of the hardest moments was not her attempts at sympathy. It was when a cousin who had been Diane's ally sat me down on a faded sofa and said, "We all believed her for so long, Evelyn, I am sorry." That apology landed like a stone and then like a balm, small, quiet victory and heavy at once. Real consequences arrived in softer but permanent forms. Diane's invitations dwindled, her name was spoken less at family gatherings, and people who once leaned on her social guidance chose distance over complicity. Karma in our story came not as dramatic punishment but as natural fallout. Diane's social circle shrank because the scaffolding of her credibility collapsed. She tried to find new allies, but people smelled the pattern and stayed away. Meanwhile, Mark and I rebuilt with deliberate empathy. We learned to say things like, "I see you and I believe you," and we began to plan a life where our home would not be a battleground for someone else's control. The ally who surprised us both was Jonah, who after months of awkwardness said, "I cannot change the past, but I can show up now." He and Tara became part of our chosen family, neighbors we fed at impromptu dinners, friends who babysat without judgment. I also took time to forgive in a way that protected myself. I forgave that Diane had been wounded in her own life, but I also made it clear that some actions had no excuse. Months later, Diane tried to reconnect with a plaintive text asking if we could talk. I replied once calmly, "I will not be attending any conversation that blames me." I offered no invitation. She never met my eyes again at Christmas, and in time she found herself facing the ripple effects of losing trust. Final twist was not malicious. At Mark's promotion the following year, he stood on the small stage to accept an award and thank the team, his wife, and then said, "To my parents who taught me how to care and also how to hold myself accountable." Diane sat in the crowd applauding, but I could see in the way people greeted her that things had shifted. She was not exiled, but she had to live with the consequences of a reputation she had built and then burned. Our new beginning was quieter than dramatic. We planted a small maple by our porch as a symbol of the life we were building separate from spite. Its trunk was thin and mottled, hopeful and tentative. One afternoon, Mark and I sat under its young branches and he said, "I am sorry it took me so long." I said, "You were raised to protect your mother. It took learning to protect ourselves to grow up." The last note, the karma moment, came when Diane, months later, called and asked if she could come by to drop off an old photo album. I met her on the porch, opened the album with hands that did not tremble, and listened while she apologized in ordinary human terms, no grand displays, just the sound of someone trying to stitch a torn fabric. I nodded, accepted the album, and said, "Thank you." But then I told her I had set healthy boundaries and that there would be new rules for being part of our lives. She reached out as if looking for absolution. I gave her neither punishment nor full welcome. I gave her a boundary and a possibility, repair, but only with honesty. That day I felt the peace that comes from standing up for yourself and choosing the people who truly belong at your table.